5 great papers, 5 different ones. Let me make some opening comments, one question, and see where it goes. As we put the conference session together, we were intrigued by the idea of juxtaposing these 2 groups, the mega and the shrinking, as 2 extremes of a spectrum of urbanization. And as this panel shows, that this question is much richer and more complex than the simple dualism. So let me use this mega versus shrinking as a starting dualism, but I assume over the next half hour we will tear it apart and maybe build new alliances. I think initially looking at these images, what's really jarring is to see paradoxically the images of overcrowding cities, particularly the images of Africa and Asia, and then also images of abandonment. Although I think Youngstown is the most vibrant, shrieking city I can think of, much to your credit. And initially this seems paradoxical, but perhaps it's also logical that this is, to paraphrase some geographers, the spatial fix, that this is actually how capitalist urbanization works. We create, or alternately create and destroy values, landscapes, and communities. And I think one question for us is, how do we actually intervene in this kind of creative destruction of growth and decline? So a few issues, I think, for us when we were forming this panel, we really asked the question, do these really 2 groups of people, these 2 kinds of cities belong together? Are there really 2 stages of an urban life cycle? Do they each kind of share a deviation from some normal viable rate and scale of urban development? To think about Goldilocks and the 3 bears, some cities grow too fast, some grow too slow, but that implies a 3rd kind of city, the one that grows just right, which is a problematic ideal. In the early post-war period, urbanists tried to create the notion of optimal city size. If we could just figure out where scale economies began to peak out and just before diseconomies of scale kicked in, that's our city size. I think we've abandoned that both. It's hard to calculate. It's unevenly distributed between rich and poor cities, and even if you figured it out in this post-Soviet era, it's hard to control population. Perhaps now we don't think about optimal city size, but instead optimal growth rates. I think thinking about the ecologist early on in the previous panel, the issue about carrying capacity really, I think, comes back to us. There's a sense that do megacities somehow exceed carrying capacities, or can they find creative ways to kind of redefine and constantly upscale their carrying capacities? And have shrinking cities fallen below some kind of notion of carrying capacity? So let me actually turn to my right first, to Jay, but others can kick in, and start with this question. We have in urbanization models of moving from small to medium to large cities. We have models of how to densify, of transforming farmland into housing states, of single-family neighborhoods into gentrified high-density areas, of expanding downtowns. But do we have models of the reverse? And is in fact shrinking or planned shrinkage simply the kind of taking our typical urban models and hitting the reverse button? Or is there some other kind of notion about that? Particularly, I think for some, it's somewhat heretical to even think about shrinking cities because so much about urbanism and urban vitality by its very nature is about growth. So how do you kind of circle the square by having vitality and shrinking at the same time?
It has been heretical to think about shrinking as it relates to cities because for so often cities have defined themselves by size and population. That's what we do here in this country, fortunately or unfortunately. Bigger is better, and somehow a bigger, smaller is inferior, so somehow you write those cities off. And no, there are no models that we're aware of, and if there are, please, by all means, let me know, as it relates to managing the shrinkage of cities. You're correct in taking agrarian farmland and then being able to turn that into a township and then seeing that township grow into a larger municipality. So those models are well established and have been for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the notion somehow we've, instead of cities shrinking, what we got was sprawl. When the cities got too big and too crowded and too polluted, instead of managing shrinkage, we just sort of moved it out, pushed it out further and further. So, however, what we are attempting to do is there's still a great deal of relevance in these cities, and it's not as easy as simply hitting the reverse button because part of that while people move, the infrastructure doesn't move, and the cost of maintaining that infrastructure doesn't move, and the obligation of servicing those people that remain doesn't go away. You know, the legal obligation, the moral obligation. So while we have been engaging in very aggressive demolition of structures that have been abandoned and dilapidated, you know, the subsurface infrastructure that still exists is a challenge that we are still trying to figure out what to do with. The fact that there are people for a variety of reasons who have to remain in cities because of their socioeconomic station in life. Cities provide a better living opportunities in terms of transportation, education, access to certain services, because there are those that elect to live in cities because they enjoy the urban experience. For a city like Youngstown, we're finding ourselves creating a model, and it's not an easy, and it's very complex, but what we have found is that the notion of the city being defined by its size is no longer heretical to discuss that there are ways to be smaller, to be better, to be more nimble, and to remain relevant. But I think it's going to be realistically probably 5 or 10 years from now before we start maybe having models that other cities, as they go through this life cycle, are able to follow. But I am glad that we are now starting to at least embark in having these conversations openly, because it wasn't until even recently that a city like Detroit, and Detroit's a great city, but political leaders in Detroit up until probably the last 12 months weren't willing to talk about a smaller Detroit, when Detroit went from 1.9 million people to 800 or some odd thousand now, somehow ignoring that or thinking just because we're Detroit, that's something that we can't talk about, or Cleveland, or you insert your name of the city here. So there are no models now, but I think that we're in the process of at least having very open and candid conversations about creating those models, and I think that those cities are going to be better off for it, but it is still going to take some time.
Okay. Let me move on to the next question, and this is inspired by the chess versus Go. One attribute some urban historians have attributed to the grid is the ability to expand, that theoretically you can just keep going. And I'm wondering, for all of you, if you think about different kinds of urban patterns, different ways to construct urban grids, both in terms of land, of roads, of infrastructure, and thinking of Myron's notion about ways to build or to map governance, as if I can stretch the term, as a kind of social infrastructure. What kind of urban patterns kind of best lend themselves to expansion? Kind of taking the old models of Rome and Beijing and then expanding them out, or thinking about a place like Youngstown as you begin to actually shrink. Are there certain kinds of cities that actually really lend themselves to expansion and to shrinking? But do other cities have a kind of infrastructure or land use pattern that actually is quite rigid and kind of fixed and not scalable?
To me? Question to me? Anyway, okay.
Since you introduced the Go board.
Yeah, when I use this comparison, actually 3 pairs of comparison, I was trying to understand, trying to see if it's possible to have a theory of largeness, a theory of quantity that is beyond quantity. So I was looking at 3 cases in order to find qualitative, structural, or ethical and political and structural philosophical quality in largeness. So in the case of Go versus chess, Go is actually a very large space. Chess is actually, structurally, chess is smaller, whereas Go is structurally larger. So I think, but I don't want to rush to see the immediate relevance to urban planning, but I think today we are moving into we are moving into urban regions, as already talked about by Edward Soldier. Well, it is a reality that we have regions of cities. So it's really, there's no center anymore. It's just a network of many centers. So spatially it's nomadic in the sense there's no center. And it's very large, but what kind of largeness? What is the structure of this largeness? That's what I want to figure out. So I was looking at historical examples to see if we can imagine philosophically there is a larger structure, a larger composition. But the consequence for urban planning is open to us to explore. But I think one of the immediate consequences, I think, is to think in an open way, in a nomadic way, rather than in a sort of classical sense of center and periphery.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of want to follow up on that
Yeah.
comment. I mean, the work of that studio was actually quite interesting because, rather than maybe a game, we had to kind of think more about gaming, and we had to sort of think about that these cities aren't necessarily gridded. I mean, they're incredibly dynamic, and they're spatializing. They're constantly changing over time. And so the way in which the studio worked is we actually looked at circuits of movements of things. And it was a kind of an attempt to not only understand where those circuits were, not just locally, but actually those circuits were clearly operating kind of at a global scale, but that those circuits were also historical. They weren't just now, but they were also in place, actually centuries ago. And so that the students really had to understand, I think, a more dynamic framework that wasn't just a grid, but was kind of multitudinous in a way. And in a way, I mean, the studio, to use kind of the buzzwords of architecture, I mean, there was a kind of parametric philosophy of understanding, well, if you look at the history of apartheid, you can't separate in Johannesburg from the mining, from, the gold that was essentially moved elsewhere, to the conditions of the mine dumps, and, the coming of FIFA. I mean, like, all of those things were essentially transforming these relationships of the city, both physically and socially. And so it's really to kind of think sort of these dynamic frameworks, I think, of urban conditions.
The logic that we have been developing through the research on the highway is what we call the lean planning, or in other words, the just-in-time planning. And that, of course, is derived from the lean production as we know it. And that's exactly what is happening, actually, in the Pearl River Delta, with this logic of the politic of laissez-faire that will allow the city or the territory to breathe, to grow, to reduce according to the needs. And, I mean, we witnessed that for years going into the various sites. And what is interesting is that it promotes flexibility and adaptability of the territory as always reinventing itself. I mean, few examples around that. I mean, the factory that we study was 10,000 workers prior to 2008 crisis, and then reduced to 3,000 in, let's say, a month or something like that. Farmers and migrant workers going back to the countryside with the difficulties that it creates. And now, just before leaving, reading in the newspaper that the Pearl River Delta is in demand for more workers to come. Then, I mean, it's maybe sounds a bit like a bit cruel as a form of urbanism, but it's a reality, and this notion of flexibility and adaptability is even evolving further, going further than the lean planning, and to something that we call the Shenzai planning, which is kind of grassroots, where the pull and the push and the pull are meeting and being reinvented on the spot, basically. Another example which is very interesting is that the 4,000 factories that have been closed during the crisis in the Pearl River Delta, government starting to give them for farming and reconverting them for other purpose. But immediately, I mean, there was a reactivity that we probably do not know much of in the West.
And if I could just encourage Myron to take a stab at it. Particularly, I'm thinking about, to what extent do we need to adapt to the changing scale and structure of human settlements by changing the lines of governance? As a West Coaster coming to Michigan, very puzzled by the kind of antiquated structure of townships that seem to fit the 19th century but not the current one, and editorializing should be abolished. Sorry to your township officials out there. And you know, it seems like at some point we had a sense of, well, there's a kind of spatial fix of governance. New York expanded to incorporate the 5 boroughs 100 plus years ago, but now no one talks about expanding New York. So I'm wondering, when you show that map of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and all the lines and the messages, the mess is inefficient. how would you redraw them?
Well, I think that the longer I think about this, the more I think that there needs to be dual-level governance on a metropolitan basis. You need something that is like Jane Jacobs' neighborhood or Gerald Frug's city, where people feel empowered and important. You know, these lines that were drawn across Michigan and Minnesota, the township lines, were lines drawn by Thomas Jefferson in the Northwest Ordinance. And the idea was to create de Tocqueville's township where people could control at a small scale something that they felt was meaningful and important. And I think that has to be part of metropolitan areas. There also needs to be a strong regional government. So there needs to be something small that's local, that's a city, and maybe cities should be, maybe they should be between 40,000 and 250,000, like Jane Jacobs thinks of a neighborhood. I don't know. Something where people feel powerful and feel that they can exercise the de Tocquevillian type of democracy and learn to be leaders. But those cities, like Frug says, have responsibilities to each other. And I think that America and democracy, American legal theory, has always been very comfortable with bifurcating power. The Constitution is and the Articles of Confederation are very much a metaphor. When the Constitution became stronger, perhaps the states became weaker, but arguably they both became stronger. And I think that Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison and Adams' discussion about this is a discussion like we need to have now about regions. We need regions that have governance. I believe they need to be democratic and accountable. I think Portland's works better than the Twin Cities because it's directly elected. But I'm also pragmatist that would say that if it were proportionally represented and the different types of suburbs had a seat at the table, that this would be an improvement. But I also believe in the local, and I think they need to exist in contrast to each other and in conflict with each other. I think that the division of sovereignty between the regional and the local needs to be a very big part of our democracy. Something that's too big becomes unaccountable and bureaucratic. It becomes like Daley's Chicago or Robert Moses's New York. But something too small becomes too parochial and too NIMBY-ish if it doesn't recognize if that locality doesn't recognize that it has rights to and obligations to the other cities. It becomes a tool of segregation and inequality.
Can I just add on to that? I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting, and this is actually research that's being done by planners, sort of working in the Midwest and places like Iowa and Illinois, is that a lot of these sort of small towns that you're describing actually are having an influx of immigrant populations who are essentially coming from Guatemala and Mexico, Senegal and Togo, all parts of the world that are essentially coming to work in meatpacking industries and kind of various food processing industries. So essentially, you do have this overlay of kind of these global relationships into these local municipalities that are in fact shaking up sort of old, kind of old conceptions of social belonging in terms of race and, economic status and whatever. And a lot of those, monies are going back to those places through remittances. So I think even in those kind of small local communities that you're getting these very kind of complex pulls of global forces. And I think not just on the corporate level, I think as Jay's talks spoke to, but I think also kind of on even the kind of working class populations as well. And then I think the character of those cities, which is one of the things I think Teddy Cruz brought up about that relationship between Tijuana and San Diego.
I am intrigued by the idea of sort of this idea that a city of a size between 40 and 250,000, and Myron's right in terms of having something. I certainly believe in having the exercise of democracy at the local level, but from firsthand experience, and I don't get a lot of Christmas cards from township officials, and I'm not anti-township or suburban, but it's the impediments that are created when you have this NIMBY. It's not in my backyard, and such a parochial mentality and an us versus them. It does breed segregation. It does breed so many impediments that it becomes counterproductive. And to the extent of being able to have a local level of control and democracy exercise, but also have that coexist with a larger regional government is something that I think would be more productive as it relates to the development of our cities. And we've seen that to a certain extent, and not that it's a perfect model, but we've seen that in places like Louisville, Kentucky, that after decades and decades and decades of trying was finally able to have I don't know if the right term is merger or consolidation of some of the local governance to a more larger regional, but there still is a degree of local control. But he's absolutely right in terms of just having it divided up to so many different layers and so many different, the state of Ohio, for instance, having 618 different local school districts just poses such an impediment, such inequality, that it makes moving these issues forward exceptionally difficult.
The way we set this up, in a way, we have cities with, you might say, too few people. It's hard to say if there's cities with too many. I think there's a normative statement if, in fact, megacities are too big. But let's, for sake of argument, say that we have that imbalance. It suggests that at this table, if we had more people from the Flints, Detroits, Youngstowns, Clevelands, and from the Lagos and Shanghais and Hong Kongs, that we should engineer here and negotiate a massive demographic swap, a kind of mass migration from one to the other. There's some amazing housing stock in the Rust Belt that is sitting empty, which leads, going from the flip to the real. I'm wondering if you want to be provocative, to suggest either critique current immigration policy or to suggest changes in immigration policy that might actually facilitate a kind of demographic swap and bring some people to these shrinking cities.
Well, there is some discussion. I can't say it's an effort that's underway, but more and more discussion about initiatives like Resettle Youngstown to provide Youngstown being, in Northeast Ohio, not necessarily not being a border state, well, border to PA, but not being a border state to like Texas and Arizona and some of those states, that Youngstown could benefit from an influx of a migrant community, to the extent of certainly the challenges that exist in terms of creating the economy or bolstering the economy. So I've been interested in some of the discussions as it came to repopulating Youngstown. Isn't necessarily going to come from the traditional means that it came from when Youngstown was established, when we had the people coming up north to work in the manufacturing industries and people from various parts of the world coming, to settle places in this country. But that has been a discussion that has probably started 3 or 4 years ago and has picked up speed to the extent I would be interested in. Again, I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form, but that discussion, the fact that it's being openly discussed to resettle Youngstown and have that resettlement take the form of inviting or making migrant populations aware of some of the benefits that would occur to relocating in a city like Youngstown.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to comment on it. This is research by, I think her name is Firanak Mirfatab, who is a planning professor, I think, in Illinois. But one of the things that she said, which was really interesting statistic about, for example, the migration coming from Africa in the last 20 years, somehow 300% of people have gone to these rural areas rather than cities. And I think it's primarily because where the work is. But I'm wondering, are there ways of beginning to understand migrations to these places that might be different from the kind of historical waves of immigrations that have happened clearly across the Midwest in the 19th century and the 20th century, precisely because new technologies allow monies to go back, contact to remain, and so the sense of a transnational identity may not essentially be the same as, the kind of immigrant populations that came and stayed and became American, but have different sense of national belongings and who they are potentially culturally. And I'm wondering how that would work in a place like Youngstown or Detroit, et cetera, as these populations come in and maybe change the character of cities.
As being myself a migrant worker, I think I can talk about that. Yeah, it's true. You usually migrate where opportunities are generated, and that's a logic of migration. Then I guess that it mostly belongs to the politic to generate those opportunities and architect will follow, probably planners as well. But I would say it's a political issue, essentially.
We have about 5 minutes, and I wanted to turn to the issue of how to imagine the megacity. And I know that in the session right after lunch, we'll be getting that too, so I'm kind of anticipating that. But in a number of your presentations, I was struck by the vivid imagery. I love the video clip, Mabel, of what city was that?
That was the market in Kumasi.
Right, and at first I thought it was slow motion because the traffic was moving too slow, but I think that was real time. Speaking about diseconomies of scale, or all the Jianfei's different attempts to try to kind of imagine these cities and issues of scale, and finally Laurent's notion about the double vision. I love those binoculars. Are they still standing or are they down?
No, they've been destroyed.
They've been destroyed. You need dual binoculars facing Youngstown. I think it reminds me, we often in urbanism have the challenge of how to imagine and therefore visualize cities, and we often have the sense of, we're looking at cities through a rear view mirror. We still have models of London when we looked at New York, models of New York when we looked at Chicago, thinking of Ed and the LA school. We still try to see Chicago and LA and so on. And so we're always playing a game of catch-up. There's this old German word about understanding the city that I love, which is the Unüberschaubarkeit, which is the inability to kind of oversee and adequately take it all in. And if that was a challenge with the industrial city, to take it all in and to understand it, with the megacity, it's only grown exponentially. So I'm wondering, as you prepare your presentations about megacities, the kinds of choices you make about what images to show, both still images, video images, drawing images. Yesterday we had painting. And if you think we are really kind of able to actually capture what megacities are all about, and if there's a kind of poverty of imagination, where might we go?
I mean, in our case, I mean, the logic of using isometric or axonometric view was really to show this logic of, I mean, it's kind of non-stop city. The region we're talking about is among those extremely large urbanized region, and this point of view of redrawing, of adding layers and layers and layers, with the difficulty, the biggest difficulties is to make the drawing dirty, actually. Drawing dust on drawing is difficult. But this kind of non-stop and reusing the logic of the traditional landscape, Chinese landscape that has been introduced, because the drawing actually are non-stop. It's really like a scroll in the traditional sense of the song scroll. And I mean, this logic of representation, or also the logic of representation underneath the highway by choosing the medium of photo and really making it colorful and extremely sharp, being enlightened as something is going on, is not the dark place. That's I mean, two logics.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of my presentation, part of the reason I actually showed the work of artists and photographers and talked about Okoye Weezer is because I think that his project as a curatorial project, and the way in which he basically took the category of African art, which is typically kind of a very traditional, very tribal art, and essentially said, well, in what ways do we think about it diasporically with artists working in Berlin that may have been, born in Johannesburg, that might be Black, white, Asian, whatever, that the way in which the world is being understood through their creative lens, which I think is something that Joy brought up yesterday, is incredibly powerful, and that he understands also that the art world is also the art market, and that the biennales and the galleries and the museums are also part of these kind of economic networked works as well. And I thought, just as architects who are speculative, that these artworks are actually useful models through which to begin to understand these cities. I mean, we had access to GIS data for Johannesburg, but there was no GIS data, for example, for for Legos. And so that idea of statistics and graphs, and which we all looked at, wasn't necessarily, that accessible, so that these kind of artworks became a lens through which to understand what was there, but also how people were envisioning a kind of future.
Well, our time is up, which is a shame, but lunch is now on the agenda, so this is a conversation hopefully we can continue. I'd like to thank the 5 wonderful presenters and also remind you after lunch, which I think is in the lobby, there are 2 sessions, one on the urban imaginary and one on new publics and public spaces. Both look outstanding as well, so thank you.